What if everything you thought you knew about Kate Middleton and Meghan Markle's infamous bridesmaid dress row was a lie? What if the story that dominated headlines, sparked endless debates, and was cemented in the minds of millions during that explosive Oprah interview had been flipped, reversed deliberately, not because of misunderstanding, but because of strategy? At 43, Kate Middleton has finally spoken, and her quiet but devastating confession doesn't just set the record straight. It blows open years of silence, painting Meghan Markle not as the victim she claimed to be, but as the orchestrator of a carefully planned narrative. And the shocking part? Kate says Meghan had been plotting the reversal of the story long before Oprah ever stepped onto that Montecito set. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Stop for a second and ask yourself, how often does the royal family break its code of silence? Almost never. That's why when Kate, the future queen consort, opens her mouth and admits the truth, the entire world freezes. But before we jump into the confession itself, we need to rewind. We need to dig into what really happened in May 2018, days before the fairy tale wedding between Meghan and Harry, when the eyes of the world were fixed on Windsor. The story of a simple dress fitting for a little girl, Princess Charlotte, was about to become a symbol of a much larger war between two women who embodied two very different futures for the monarchy. But let's be clear, this was never just about a dress. This was about identity, power, image, and control. Meghan, the outsider-turned-duchess, who had Hollywood savvy and a sharp understanding of the media game, and Kate, the loyal, patient, quietly enduring future queen, who had built her public image on grace, stability, and restraint. When those two forces collided over satin and lace, what followed was a media explosion that left Kate in tears and Meghan with a decision: accept the narrative or rewrite it. She chose the latter. The first reports were simple, almost sympathetic. Kate was exhausted. She had just given birth to Prince Louis. She was hormonal, stretched thin, and the stress of a high-pressure wedding week was too much. Meghan had been demanding about the fit of Charlotte's bridesmaid dress. Words were exchanged, and Kate was left in tears. The world heard it, nodded, and largely understood. After all, who hadn't cried under pressure at a wedding? But somewhere inside Meghan, that version of events was unacceptable. It left her as the aggressor, the one who had upset Britain's beloved Duchess of Cambridge. And Meghan couldn't afford that. Not then. Not ever. So the seeds of a reversal were planted. Years later, during the Oprah Winfrey interview watched by millions, Meghan calmly flipped the story on its head. She claimed that it was Kate who made her cry, not the other way around. With a smile and a sigh, Meghan painted herself as the misunderstood, wronged woman, even adding that Kate had brought her flowers afterward to apologize. And just like that, millions of viewers believed her. The world shifted. Kate, once the victim, was now the aggressor in Meghan's carefully curated tale. But according to Kate, this wasn't a slip of memory or a matter of perspective. This was orchestration. Think about the weight of that for a moment. Meghan wasn't just correcting a rumor. She was rebranding herself. She took an unflattering moment and spun it into a sympathetic headline, one that could be weaponized in the broader narrative of her struggles inside the monarchy. And it worked. Almost instantly, the headlines changed. Commentators who had once criticized Meghan for making Kate cry suddenly switched sides. Social media lit up with anger toward Kate, accusing her of being cold, elitist, and unsupportive. Meghan had flipped the story, and she had done it on one of the world's biggest platforms, with one of the most trusted interviewers alive. So why did Kate stay silent? Why didn't she stand up in 2021 and refute Meghan's claims? Why did she allow herself to be cast as the villain in a story she says was a complete fabrication? That's where the royal code of silence comes in. For years, Kate embodied the unofficial motto: never complain, never explain. It wasn't her role to battle in the press. Her job was to rise above, to let dignity and time do the work. But at 43, with a decade of public service behind her, with 3 children growing up under the shadow of this never-ending feud, and with her own image constantly twisted in the process, Kate finally decided to speak. And when she did, it wasn't with bitterness, it was with clarity. She admitted that the original story, the one reported before Oprah, was true. Meghan had been demanding about the dress fitting. Charlotte had been upset. Kate, already fragile from postpartum recovery, was overwhelmed. Tears were shed. And yes, Kate later sent flowers, not as an admission of guilt, but as an attempt at reconciliation. That nuance, Kate says, was twisted beyond recognition. And Meghan didn't just twist it. She plotted to twist it long before the cameras rolled. Kate's words paint a picture of a woman who had been silently carrying the weight of a falsehood for years, watching it eat away at her reputation, while the other side basked in sympathy. Now, let me ask you, what does this confession really mean? It's not just about clearing Kate's name. It's about trust. It's about credibility. If Meghan could flip a story about something as small as a dress, what else might she have reshaped? What other moments that we, the public, have accepted as gospel truth might actually be carefully spun illusions? This is where the irony stings the most. Meghan once accused the royal family of controlling the narrative, of silencing her, of protecting Kate at her expense. But in this instance, it was Meghan who controlled the story, and Kate who was silenced by duty, by dignity, and by the heavy expectations of a future queen. The timing of Kate's confession also matters. At 43, she is no longer the young bride nervously navigating her role in the firm. She is a seasoned royal, a mother, a global figure in her own right. Her words carry more weight than ever before. And they come at a moment when the monarchy is under intense scrutiny, with questions swirling about its future, its relevance, and its fractures. By speaking now, Kate isn't just defending herself, she's sending a warning. A warning about manipulation, about image, and about the dangerous power of narrative in a world where perception often outweighs truth. And this raises a chilling question for us all. If the royal family, with its centuries-old institution and rigid control over image, can be undone by a single flipped story, what hope do the rest of us have in a world dominated by spin and social media warfare? Kate's confession isn't just personal, it's universal. It's a reminder that behind every polished interview, every sympathetic headline, there may be a strategy, a carefully laid plan designed not to reveal the truth, but to shape it. But perhaps the most haunting part of this introduction is not what Kate said. It's what she didn't. She didn't lash out. She didn't name-call. She didn't accuse Meghan of lying outright. Instead, she described the events with quiet precision, allowing the contrast between what really happened and what the world was told to speak for itself. That restraint, that unwillingness to drag Meghan's name through the mud, ironically strengthens Kate's credibility. Because let's face it, if Kate were bitter, if she had come out swinging, many would dismiss her as defensive. But instead, her calm confession cuts sharper than any attack ever could. So where does that leave us? With a dress that became a battlefield, with two women locked in a silent war over image, truth, and reputation, with one side armed with Hollywood tactics and media-savvy maneuvers, and the other carrying the crushing weight of royal silence. And with a confession that, even years later, changes the way we see not just that infamous wedding week, but the entire Harry and Meghan saga. But here's the twist. Kate's confession is only the beginning. Because as much as it clears her name, it also exposes the deeper fractures within the royal family, fractures that started long before the dress row and continue to this very day. And what comes next will make you question not just Meghan's role, but Harry's silence. What if the story of the bridesmaid's dress wasn't the spark, but the symptom? What if this wasn't just about a little girl's dress, but a sign of something much bigger simmering beneath the surface, ready to explode? Because here's the truth. The dress row was never just about fabric, hems, or lace. It was about identity. It was about the pressure of two women forced into roles they didn't choose. And it was about the inevitable clash between an institution built on centuries of silence and an outsider who knew how to weaponize words. So let's rewind. Back to May 2018. The fairy tale wedding the world had been waiting for was days away. Windsor Castle was buzzing. The press had camped outside, and the world was already spinning headlines before the first vows were even spoken. But behind those grand gates, in a quiet room filled with tiny dresses and frazzled staff, the first crack in the Meghan and Kate dynamic was about to split wide open. It started innocently enough. Princess Charlotte's bridesmaid dress, a delicate, custom-made piece designed by Givenchy's Claire Waite Keller, intended to look picture-perfect for the cameras. But when the fittings began, the dresses didn't fit quite right. They were too loose, too baggy. And in the world of royal weddings, where every photograph lasts forever, that wasn't acceptable. Meghan, under the crushing weight of a global spotlight, wanted perfection. Kate, exhausted, barely weeks out from giving birth to Prince Louis, wanted calm. The two visions collided, and neither woman was willing to budge. Here's where it gets emotional. Imagine Kate in that moment. Postpartum, hormones crashing, still recovering physically, balancing two toddlers and a newborn while also preparing for one of the most high-profile weddings in modern history. Then imagine Meghan, new to the family, still adjusting, but also laser-focused on controlling the image of her wedding day. Two women under immense pressure. Two women in very different states of mind. Add a room full of seamstresses, royal aides, and a nervous little girl caught in the middle. The result? Tension sharp enough to cut through satin. Now here's the twist. According to the first reports, Kate left in tears. Staff whispered that she felt humiliated, overwhelmed, and blindsided by Meghan's demands. Meghan's defenders insist she was under impossible stress, that Kate didn't understand the cultural weight Meghan was carrying, the fear of being judged, not just as a bride, but as the first biracial royal bride in history. Can you see the contradiction? Both sides had reasons to feel wronged. Both sides had reasons to cry. Yet in the world of perception, there could only be one victim. And Meghan, years later, made sure it wasn't her. But let's pause. Why did the press latch onto this story in the first place? Out of all the possible palace dramas, why did a single tear in the lead-up to a wedding become front-page news? Because it symbolized something deeper. For years, the media had painted Kate as the golden daughter-in-law, graceful, compliant, adored by the Queen. Meghan was portrayed as brash, demanding, and difficult. The dress row fit perfectly into that narrative. Meghan made Kate cry? Of course she did, the press said. That's who Meghan was. Or so they claimed. And this is where the contradiction becomes unbearable. Because while Meghan was framed as the aggressor at the time, she was silently preparing for the long game. She knew that public sympathy could be flipped, that a narrative could be rewritten. That one day, she would get her chance to sit down in front of millions and tell her side of the story. And when that day came, she didn't just shift the focus. She reversed the polarity. She painted herself as the wronged one, and Kate as the instigator. It was strategic. It was devastatingly effective. And according to Kate, it was deliberate. But let's not lose sight of the human cost here. Think about Princess Charlotte, a little girl no older than 4 at the time, caught in the crossfire of two powerful women, unaware that her tiny dress would ignite a storm that would rage for years. Think about the aides, the seamstresses, the palace staff, forced to watch as tensions boiled, knowing that whispers from that room would eventually leak into tabloids hungry for scandal. And most of all, think about Kate, already fragile, left sobbing, then forced to plaster on a smile days later, walking into St. George's Chapel as though nothing had happened. Does that sound like the behavior of someone who made Meghan cry? Or does it sound like the quiet endurance of a woman forced to shoulder the burden of silence, even when the truth painted her as the victim? Now here's where it gets truly unsettling. Kate's confession at 43 doesn't just validate those early reports. It reveals that Meghan had planned to flip the story long before Oprah. She wanted the sympathy. She wanted the victim card. She wanted the world to see her as the misunderstood bride, bullied by the stoic, perfect Kate. And she got exactly that. For years, the public conversation shifted. Meghan was applauded for her vulnerability. Kate was criticized for her supposed cruelty. And the truth? It was buried under flowers, apologies, and a silence that stretched on until Kate finally broke it. And this leaves us with one burning question. Why? Why would Meghan go to such lengths over something as trivial as a dress? The answer is simple, but brutal. Because it wasn't trivial at all. It was about image. Weddings are not just ceremonies in the royal world. They are global spectacles. Every detail matters. And in Meghan's eyes, the bridesmaid dresses were not just clothes. They were statements. Imperfect dresses meant imperfect photographs. Imperfect photographs meant criticism. And criticism meant weakness. Meghan couldn't afford that. Not when she was already battling the press, already feeling isolated, already aware that one slip could haunt her forever. So yes, the dress row mattered. Not because of the lace, not because of the tears, but because it gave Meghan a perfect chance to rewrite her role. She was no longer the demanding bride. She was the wrong duchess. And Kate, once adored, became the cold aggressor in Meghan's story. But let me ask you this. If Meghan could flip the narrative here, what else could she have flipped? If this small, intimate moment could be rebranded so effectively, how many other palace dramas have been repackaged, retold, and resold to us as truth? How much of what we think we know about Meghan and Harry's time in the firm is actually real, and how much is narrative warfare? And here's the kicker. The dress row wasn't just the beginning of Meghan and Kate's fractured relationship. It was the opening chapter of a family feud that would eventually drag in Harry, William, Charles, and even the late Queen herself. Because once Meghan realized how powerful her version of events could be, once she saw the world sympathize with her tears on Oprah, there was no going back. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand how the press latched onto this story, twisted it, and created a feeding frenzy that would set the stage for everything that followed. Because the original story, the one whispered to journalists, splashed across tabloids, was not the end. It was just the first move in a game of perception that would change the monarchy forever. And that's where we go next. Into the world of headlines, paparazzi, and media spin. Because the moment Kate's tears hit the papers, the battle wasn't just between two women anymore. It was between two narratives, two legacies, and two futures of the crown. What happens when a single headline rewrites history? What happens when a whisper from behind palace walls becomes a front-page scandal, shaping the way millions see two women who will define the future of the monarchy? That's exactly what happened after the bridesmaid's dress row slipped from a private room into the hungry jaws of the press. Because once the tabloids got their hands on it, the story didn't just belong to Kate or Meghan anymore. It belonged to the world. And the way the world consumed it would set the stage for years of division. The first wave of headlines was brutal. Meghan made Kate cry. Simple, punchy, devastating. For Meghan, it was a dagger. For Kate, it was a strange kind of vindication, but one she could never publicly acknowledge. And for the press, it was gold. Two duchesses, a royal wedding, tears. It had everything. They didn't need details. They didn't need proof. Just the image of Kate in tears while Meghan played the role of the difficult diva was enough to sell papers and flood online comment sections. But here's the contradiction that makes this story so haunting. The truth, according to Kate, was already twisted the moment it hit the press. Because while it was true that she cried, the reason why, the context, was conveniently left out. The nuance was stripped away. What remained was a black-and-white narrative. Meghan the aggressor, Kate the victim. The press had chosen their roles. And the audience, eager for drama, accepted them without question. Now think about the timing. This was May 2018. Meghan was still the new duchess, still the glamorous American outsider who had married into royalty. Public opinion was still on her side, at least in certain corners. But the British tabloids had already sharpened their knives. Meghan wasn't Diana 2.0. They decided she was a diva. A demanding starlet who didn't understand the rules of the game. And the dress row fit perfectly into that narrative. Ask yourself this. What would you do if the world painted you as a bully before you even had a chance to tell your side? Would you stay silent? Would you fight back? Meghan, as we now know, chose to bide her time. But the seeds of her frustration were planted in those very headlines. And by the time she sat down with Oprah 3 years later, she hadn't just remembered the story differently. She had weaponized it. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because in 2018, the world only saw one version. Meghan made Kate cry. And the sympathy poured in for Kate. The British public adored her even more. She was the relatable royal, the young mother balancing newborn chaos with royal duty, now wounded by her brash American sister-in-law. For Kate, it was bittersweet. Sympathy on the outside. Silence on the inside. She couldn't confirm the story. She couldn't deny it. She had to smile, wave, and pretend nothing had happened. And here's where the irony bites. The press that protected Kate in 2018 would one day turn against her, using Meghan's version of events to cast her as cold, unfeeling, even cruel. The same headlines that had once built her up would later tear her down. That's the ruthless cycle of media spin. Heroes today, villains tomorrow. But let's step inside the palace for a moment. Imagine the atmosphere. Staff whispering in corridors. Senior royals shaking their heads. William furious that his wife was dragged into Meghan's chaos. Harry, defensive, rallying behind Meghan, insisting the press was out to get her. The Queen, stoic, reminding everyone that silence was the only. But let's step inside the palace for a moment. Imagine the atmosphere. Staff whispering in corridors. Senior royals shaking their heads. William furious that his wife was dragged into Meghan's chaos. Harry, defensive, rallying behind Meghan, insisting the press was out to get her. The Queen, stoic, reminding everyone that silence was the only option. Never complain. Never explain. And yet, the silence only fed the fire. The less the royals said, the more the press speculated. And the more they speculated, the more Meghan and Kate became caricatures instead of people. Do you see the contradiction? Silence was supposed to protect them. Instead, it made the scandal grow. And here's another twist most people forget. At the time, Meghan's Hollywood connections saw the headlines too. Friends, publicists, even former colleagues reached out. They told her she had to fight back. That this image of her making the future queen cry would stick forever if she didn't. But Meghan couldn't speak then. Not yet. She was still inside the firm. She had to play the long game. And play it. She did. Meanwhile, Kate's silence wasn't strategy. It was survival. She couldn't afford to look petty, to wade into a fight over something as small as a dress. She bore the sympathy quietly, even though it came wrapped in humiliation. Because let's be honest, does anyone really want to be pitted for crying at a dress fitting? But pity has power. And Meghan knew it. Which is why, years later, she chose to flip the script. Not because the original story had been misunderstood, but because the sympathy had landed on the wrong side. This is where we see the genius and the danger of narrative warfare. The tabloids framed Meghan as the aggressor in 2018. Meghan reframed herself as the victim in 2021. And the world, fickle as ever, followed whichever story was told last. That's the curse of modern media. Truth doesn't matter. Timing does. And here's the chilling thought. If the press had never leaked the story in 2018, would Meghan have felt the need to reverse it in 2021? Or was the reversal always the plan, waiting for the perfect moment? Kate's confession suggests the latter. That Meghan orchestrated the flip deliberately, preparing it long before Oprah ever asked the question. And if that's true, then the dress row wasn't just drama. It was strategy. But strategy cuts both ways. Because while Meghan gained sympathy in the short term, Kate's confession years later reopens the wound. It forces us to re-examine not just the dress row, but every single revelation Meghan has ever made. If she could manipulate this story, what else has been shaped for the cameras? And if Kate stayed silent for this long, what other truths are buried beneath her composure? The press made this fight public. Meghan made it personal. Kate made it timeless. And the fallout is still rippling today. But this is only the beginning of the media spin. Because after the dress row hit the headlines, the narrative didn't stay still. It evolved. It grew. It became the foundation for the Duchess divide, the press's favorite storyline of all. And what happened next would set Kate and Meghan on a collision course that no apology, no flowers, and no carefully staged photographs could ever undo. What if I told you that the bridesmaid dress wasn't the true battlefield at all, that it was merely the opening shot in a much larger war? Because once the headlines painted Meghan as the aggressor and Kate as the weeping victim, the stakes skyrocketed. Suddenly, it wasn't just about two women clashing over lace and tulle. It was about reputations. It was about global sympathy. It was about control. And behind palace walls, Kate Middleton was suffering in silence, carrying the weight of a scandal she didn't ask for, while Meghan Markle was quietly laying the groundwork for a reversal that would one day shake the world. So let's step inside Kate's world in those fragile weeks after the dress row. Imagine the scene. A woman just weeks postpartum. Her body still healing. Her hormones surging. Sleepless nights with a newborn in her arms, and the constant demands of royal life pressing down on her shoulders. Then add the pressure of being Britain's future queen. Every hair out of place. Every expression caught by the cameras. Every stumble magnified into a headline. Now layer onto that the humiliation of seeing whispers about her private tears splashed across the tabloids. Can you feel the weight of that? Kate, who had built her public image on composure, grace, and patience, suddenly found herself portrayed as fragile, emotional, vulnerable. For some, it made her relatable. For others, it raised eyebrows. Was the perfect Duchess cracking under the strain? Was Meghan the storm that could shake Kate's carefully built castle? And yet, even as the world speculated, Kate said nothing. She smiled at public engagements. She carried on with her duties. She kept her silence, just as the Queen's mantra demanded. Never complain, never explain. But inside, according to those close to her, Kate was devastated. She felt betrayed that something so private had been leaked. She felt exposed by the press coverage. And most of all, she felt trapped, unable to correct the record without breaking the very rules she had been raised to follow. Here's the cruel contradiction. Silence was supposed to protect her. Instead, it imprisoned her. Meanwhile, Meghan wasn't satisfied with the public perception. Yes, the headlines had cast her as the villain. But to Meghan, that wasn't just unfair, it was unacceptable. Because Meghan knew how powerful public narratives could be. She had spent years in Hollywood, navigating scripts, auditions, and PR machines. She knew the difference between playing the villain and playing the victim. And she wasn't about to let herself be typecast in the biggest role of her life. So what did Kate do? She tried to make peace. She sent flowers. She sent a note. She reached out, offering an olive branch to her new sister-in-law. Because that's who Kate was. The peacemaker. The quiet diplomat. The woman who tried to smooth things over, even when she wasn't at fault. But here's the twist. Meghan later used that very gesture as evidence against her. In the Oprah interview, Meghan mentioned those flowers, framing them as an apology for causing her pain, not the other way around. Do you see the irony? Kate's attempt at reconciliation became a weapon in Meghan's hands. And that's why Kate's confession at 43 carries so much weight. Because she finally admitted that those flowers weren't an admission of guilt. They were an attempt at kindness. A moment of dignity in the middle of a storm. Yet the world only ever heard Meghan's interpretation. And that silence, that refusal to defend herself, haunted Kate for years. Now think about the emotional toll of that. Imagine watching yourself be cast as the aggressor in a story where you were the one in tears. Imagine biting your tongue while the world criticized you for cruelty, knowing the truth but bound by duty to keep it hidden. Imagine raising 3 children under the shadow of that falsehood, knowing one day they would read the headlines too. Would you have stayed silent? Or would you, like Kate, wait for the right moment to finally speak? Here's the shocking truth. Kate's silence may have protected the monarchy, but it destroyed her peace. Behind closed doors, friends say she struggled with the injustice of it all. She worried about the long-term damage to her image. She feared that Meghan's narrative, once cemented, would overshadow her own legacy. And she carried that weight for years, until finally, at 43, she broke the silence. But there's another layer here. Because while Kate was suffering quietly, Meghan was not standing still. She was preparing. She was strategizing. She was biding her time, waiting for the perfect stage to unveil her version of events. And that stage came in March 2021, when Oprah Winfrey sat across from her and asked the question that would flip the story forever. But before we get to Oprah, we need to understand one thing. Kate's suffering wasn't just personal, it was political. Because her silence allowed the narrative to grow, unchallenged, in the public mind. And by the time Meghan flipped it, the world was ready to believe her. Why? Because Kate's quiet endurance had been twisted into coldness. Her composure looked like detachment. Her silence looked like guilt. And that's the heartbreaking contradiction of Kate Middleton. The very qualities that made her beloved, the patience, the restraint, the refusal to engage in petty drama, became the very tools used against her. Meghan weaponized Kate's silence. And the world believed it. But here's the cliffhanger. Meghan didn't just flip the dress row. She set the stage for an entire narrative shift that would redefine her relationship with the monarchy, with the press, and with Kate herself. Because when the Oprah interview aired, the dress row was just one story among many. And Meghan used it as a foundation, a building block in a larger argument that she was the true victim of the firm. Imagine this. The world is watching. The setting is serene, almost dreamlike. Lush greenery, rustic chairs, Oprah Winfrey seated across from Meghan Markle and Prince Harry in that infamous California garden. The lighting is soft. The atmosphere is intimate. But make no mistake, This wasn't just a conversation. This was war. A war of words. A war of perception. And right at the center of it, the bridesmaid dress row. Oprah leans in, her voice low, calculated. There were reports that you made Kate cry. Is that true? And then Meghan smiles. Soft, composed, deliberate. She pauses, just long enough to let the tension build, to make sure every viewer at home is leaning closer to their screens. Then she drops the line that flips the story upside down. No, she says calmly. The reverse happened. Just like that, history is rewritten. Think about the power of those 3 words. They didn't just correct the record, they inverted it. Overnight, Kate Middleton went from being the victim to being the aggressor, from being the weeping duchess to being the cold tormentor. And Meghan? She became the wronged one. The misunderstood duchess who had been silenced and attacked, yet still offered grace by saying Kate had apologized with flowers. Do you see the contradiction? Meghan managed to play both the victim and the magnanimous forgiver in one breath. She claimed Kate hurt her, but also that Kate had tried to make amends. That contradiction is what made the story stick. It felt raw, layered, and believable. But according to Kate's later confession, it was a masterstroke of manipulation. Now, pause and ask yourself, why did Meghan choose this moment? Oprah, 2021, the height of royal tension. To flip the story? Because timing is everything. By then, she and Harry had left the monarchy. They were free. They had signed the Netflix and Spotify deals. They were carving out a new brand in America, one built on victimhood, resilience, and independence from the so-called firm. To sell that narrative, Meghan needed examples. Proof that she had been mistreated. And what better proof than the story everyone already knew, but from her perspective. Here's the emotional sting. Kate, who had carried the burden of silence for years, had no platform to respond. She was trapped, bound by royal duty. She couldn't sit down with Oprah. She couldn't release her side in a memoir. She couldn't tweet her truth to the world. The very silence that defined her role became her prison, while Meghan wielded words like weapons in front of millions. And Oprah? She didn't push. She didn't question the contradiction. She let Meghan's version stand, unchallenged. Why? Because this wasn't journalism. It was spectacle. It was a global performance designed to shock, to provoke, to trend. And Meghan knew exactly how to deliver her lines. But let's dig deeper into the irony. Meghan claimed Kate made her cry, but also admitted that Kate had apologized. If Meghan had truly forgiven her, why bring it up years later on the world stage? Why revive a private moment, unless the goal wasn't closure, but ammunition? That's the contradiction Kate herself hinted at in her confession at 43, that Meghan's narrative wasn't about truth, it was about leverage. Now think about the aftermath. The morning after the Oprah interview aired, headlines around the globe screamed the same line. Kate made Meghan cry. Social media exploded. Sympathy surged for Meghan. And Kate? She was slaughtered online. The same woman who had been pitted in 2018 was now cast as the cold-hearted duchess who bullied her sister-in-law. Overnight, her image was flipped. The press that once adored her suddenly questioned her compassion. And here's the emotional gut punch. Kate's children were old enough to hear whispers, to see headlines, to ask questions. Imagine having your daughter, Princess Charlotte, one day Googling her own name and seeing it tied to a scandal that never should have been hers to carry. That's the weight Kate was holding in silence, while Meghan built her empire on the sympathy of millions. But here's where the story twists even further. Because Meghan's version didn't just damage Kate, it set the tone for the rest of the Oprah interview. It framed Meghan as the victim, paving the way for her more explosive claims about racism, neglect, and mental health. The bridesmaid dress was the appetizer. The real feast was still to come. But without flipping that first story, without establishing Kate as the aggressor, would the rest of Meghan's revelations have landed with the same force? That's the chilling part. The dress row was not just a memory, it was a narrative device. A carefully chosen story used to soften the audience, to tilt the scales of sympathy before the real bombs were dropped. But now, years later, with Kate's confession, the cracks are showing. If Meghan twisted this, how much else was twisted? If Kate's silence was misrepresented, how many other silences have been weaponized? And here's where Harry's role becomes impossible to ignore. He sat next to Meghan during that Oprah interview. He heard her version of the dress row. He said nothing to contradict it. He let Kate, his sister-in-law, be painted as the villain, even though he knew the truth. Why? Was it loyalty to Meghan? Was it resentment toward William and Kate? Or was it something darker? A willingness to let the truth burn if it meant strengthening his wife's story? Let's ask the question no one dares. Was Harry complicit in the narrative flip? Because once Meghan spoke those 3 words, the reverse happened. The damage was permanent. Kate's image was tarnished. Harry's silence confirmed it. And the monarchy's divide deepened. But here's the cliffhanger. What Meghan didn't realize at the time was that the flowers, the very ones she used as proof of Kate's guilt, were about to resurface years later in Kate's confession. And when they did, the meaning of that gesture would flip again, unraveling Meghan's narrative and raising questions that go far beyond a single dress. What if the flowers were never meant as an apology at all? What if the simple bouquet, handed over with a note, wasn't Kate admitting guilt, but Kate doing what she had always done, choosing grace over conflict? Because here's the revelation that changes everything. Those flowers weren't about saying, "I'm sorry." They were about saying, "Let's move on." They were about peace, not surrender. And yet, years later, Meghan would use that gesture as Exhibit A in her version of the story, proof that Kate had admitted to wrongdoing. Do you see the contradiction? A moment of kindness twisted into a symbol of guilt. A peace offering weaponized as ammunition. And in that single flip, Meghan managed to transform Kate's quiet dignity into a public indictment. Let's rewind again to that week in May 2018. The dresses didn't fit. Charlotte was upset. Meghan, under the crushing weight of a wedding that was more global event than family celebration, wanted everything perfect. Kate, still raw from childbirth, wasn't in a place to handle conflict. Voices rose. Tears fell. And when the dust settled, Kate, ever the diplomat, sent flowers. Because that's who she was. Someone who built bridges, not walls. Someone who smoothed rough edges, even when she wasn't the one at fault. Now imagine Meghan opening those flowers. To most people, a bouquet would symbolize reconciliation, a truce. But Meghan saw something else. Leverage. Proof. A tangible token she could later cite as evidence that Kate had wronged her. It was brilliant, in a cold, calculated way. Because years later, when she sat in Oprah's garden, all she had to do was mention the flowers, and the world would nod. Of course, Kate apologized. That means Meghan was telling the truth. But according to Kate's confession, that interpretation was a lie. Here's where the emotional sting cuts deep. For years, Meghan's version stood uncontested. The flowers became a footnote, a detail that added credibility to her story. Meanwhile, Kate, trapped in silence, had to watch her gesture of kindness turned into a weapon against her. Can you imagine the frustration? The helplessness? To know the world believed you had admitted guilt when, in reality, you had done nothing of the sort? And here's the heartbreaking irony. Kate's silence was rooted in loyalty, to the monarchy, to tradition, to the very institution Meghan claimed had silenced her. Kate stayed quiet because that was her role. She didn't defend herself, even when she was being painted as cruel, because she believed the bigger picture mattered more than her personal pain. But Meghan, free from those constraints, turned Kate's restraint into guilt, her grace into shame. Now ask yourself, why didn't Kate speak sooner? Why didn't she correct the record when the Oprah interview shook the world? Because timing, in the royal family, is everything. To break silence too soon would have looked defensive, petty, beneath her. Kate knew that. She endured the humiliation for years because she believed her time would come. And at 43, it finally did. In her confession, Kate reframed the flowers not as an apology, but as an attempt at reconciliation. A way to draw a line under the incident, to protect the family from further fracture. That nuance, the difference between apology and reconciliation, changes everything. Because it reveals Meghan's narrative not as a misunderstanding, but as a deliberate misrepresentation. Think about how devastating that is. For Meghan, the flowers were proof of Kate's cruelty. For Kate, the flowers were proof of her kindness. Two women, two interpretations, one gesture. And the world had to choose which version to believe. But here's the chilling part. Kate's confession forces us to re-examine the rest of Meghan's narrative. If she twisted this, what else did she twist? If she weaponized flowers, what other details, texts, conversations, gestures, were recast to suit her story? And if Kate's peace offering was flipped into evidence of guilt, then how much of the Oprah interview was performance rather than truth? The fallout of this revelation isn't just personal, it's institutional. Because the monarchy, built on silence and dignity, now finds itself at the mercy of narratives that can be shaped, spun, and sold. And Kate's flowers proved just how dangerous that game can be. Now picture this: Meghan sitting across from Oprah, mentioning the flowers with that calm, knowing smile. And somewhere in Kensington Palace, Kate watching, her heart sinking, knowing that her attempt at reconciliation had just been turned against her. Now picture this: Meghan sitting across from Oprah, mentioning the flowers with that calm, knowing smile. And somewhere in Kensington Palace, Kate watching, her heart sinking, knowing that her attempt at reconciliation had just been turned against her. That's the tragedy of the bridesmaid dress row. Not the tears, not the fight, but the betrayal of a gesture meant to heal, transformed into a weapon meant to wound. And here's where it gets darker. Because Meghan's strategy didn't end with flowers. The dress row was just the first narrative she flipped. The victim card was her most powerful weapon, and she was about to play it again and again. Mental health, racism, isolation, each story building on the last, each one casting her as the wrong duchess in a palace of cruelty. And if she could spin a dress into a sob story, imagine what she could do with far bigger issues. But Kate's confession at 43 doesn't just expose Meghan's tactic. It raises a terrifying question for the monarchy itself. If silence can be so easily weaponized, if gestures of kindness can be twisted into admissions of guilt, then how can the royals ever protect themselves in a world ruled by perception? Because the flowers weren't the end. They were the beginning. The first sign that this wasn't just a family feud, it was narrative warfare. And the next battlefield? Sympathy itself. Because Meghan wasn't just flipping stories. She was flipping the entire script of who was victim and who was villain. And Kate's flowers were simply the first prop in a drama that would shake the monarchy to its core. What if victimhood itself was the most powerful crown of all? What if the true battle between Kate and Meghan wasn't over titles, tiaras, or even dresses, but over who could claim the role of the wronged woman? Because after the bridesmaid dress row was flipped, after the flowers were weaponized, Meghan Markle had found the ultimate strategy. Playing the victim in a monarchy that had no voice to fight back. And here's the haunting contradiction. Kate had the truth, but Meghan had the microphone. Let's pull back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Meghan wasn't the first royal to use sympathy as a weapon. Princess Diana did it decades earlier, when she sat down with Martin Bashir and declared, "There were three of us in this marriage." That one line destroyed Prince Charles's reputation for years and cemented Diana as the victim in the public's eyes. Meghan, consciously or not, followed the same playbook, but with one critical difference. Diana's pain was real, visible, undeniable. Meghan's, according to Kate's confession, was crafted, rehearsed, and strategically deployed. And the dress row? That was her test run. Because let's be brutally honest. If Meghan could flip the story of a crying child's dress fitting, if she could turn a peace offering into proof of guilt, then she proved to herself and the world that she could bend perception at will. That realization was dangerous. It gave her the confidence to step onto Oprah's stage and lay down a series of bombshells that painted the monarchy as a cruel, cold, racist machine. But here's the twist. By making Kate the villain of the dress row, Meghan secured her audience's sympathy before the real accusations even began. The logic was simple. If Kate, the beloved future queen, could be cruel to Meghan, then surely the rest of the firm was capable of far worse. Do you see how powerful that was? The dress row wasn't a footnote. It was the foundation. And poor Kate, she became the sacrificial lamb. Think about the emotional toll of that. Imagine sitting in your Kensington Palace apartment, watching the interview unfold on television, hearing your name dragged into the mud, and knowing you can't say a word in your defense. William seething beside you. Advisors telling you to stay quiet. Your children sleeping upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling outside. Can you feel the suffocating frustration? The injustice of being branded the villain in a story where you were the one in tears? Kate bore it all in silence. But Meghan? Meghan used it as fuel. Because once she had painted herself as the victim of Kate's cruelty, she expanded the narrative. Suddenly, she wasn't just the Duchess who cried over a bridesmaid dress. She was the Duchess who begged for help with her mental health and was ignored. She was the Duchess who endured concerns about her unborn child's skin color. She was the Duchess who had been trapped, silenced, and cast aside. And millions believed her. But here's where the contradictions creep in. Meghan claimed she was silenced, yet she sat on Oprah's stage with the freedom to tell her story to the world. She claimed she was friendless, yet her Hollywood circle rallied around her. She claimed she was the victim of palace cruelty, yet her most memorable example, the dress row, was built on a reversal that Kate says was orchestrated. Can you see the pattern? Every story crafted for maximum sympathy, every detail bent just enough to keep Meghan in the role of the wronged woman. And here's the kicker. Harry enabled it. He sat beside her, nodding, adding his own grievances, confirming her narrative by omission if not by outright words. He let Kate, his brother's wife, the woman who had once been like a sister to him, be framed as the cold aggressor. That silence wasn't just complicity, it was betrayal. Not just of Kate, but of William. The dress row fractured more than a sister-in-law relationship. It cracked the bond between two brothers who had once been inseparable. And the palace? They had no defense. Bound by their code of silence, they watched helplessly as Meghan's version spread across the globe, staining Kate's reputation and shaking the monarchy's credibility. For the first time, the firm realized that silence wasn't strength anymore. In a digital world, silence was weakness. And Meghan knew it. But here's the most chilling part. According to Kate's confession, Meghan didn't stumble into this strategy, she planned it. The dress row wasn't just a memory retold in 2021. It was a weapon sharpened years earlier, held back until it could be unleashed at the perfect moment. That makes the betrayal even deeper. Because it means Meghan didn't just distort the truth. She stored it, nurtured it, waited for the stage. And Kate? She had no idea. She thought her flowers had ended the feud. She thought her silence had buried the story. She thought time would heal. But Meghan was playing chess while Kate was playing checkers. So ask yourself, if Meghan could manipulate sympathy so effectively with something as small as a dress, what else could she have shaped? How many other cracks in the royal family's foundation were widened by narrative flips? And most importantly, if Meghan was willing to sacrifice Kate's reputation for her own gain, what did that say about the future of the monarchy itself? Because here's the cliffhanger. The dress row was only Act 1. The real war was about to begin. A war not just between Meghan and Kate, but between truth and perception, between silence and spectacle, between a monarchy built on image and a duchess who knew how to weaponize it. What happens when silence becomes a weapon turned against you? What happens when your refusal to fight back, your loyalty to an institution, your dignity in keeping quiet is twisted into proof of guilt? That's the prison Kate Middleton found herself trapped in after Meghan Markle's Oprah interview. The world believed Meghan. Why? Because Kate said nothing. And in the court of public opinion, silence isn't neutrality, it's an admission. This is where Kate's suffering deepened. Because behind the palace walls, she wasn't just battling the fallout of a flipped story. She was living with the emotional toll of being cast as the villain in the eyes of millions. Imagine raising 3 children while tabloids splashed your name across headlines as the woman who made Meghan cry. Imagine knowing that one day, those children would read the story, would Google their mother's name, and wonder why she never defended herself. Can you feel the quiet agony of that? Kate's inner circle whispered about the toll it took on her. Friends noticed her smile seemed tighter, her laughter more rehearsed. William, furious, wanted to speak out, but palace advisors reminded him that the family's reputation depended on restraint. The Queen herself was said to be disappointed, not in Kate, but in the spectacle. This family does not air its laundry, she had reportedly reminded them. And so, once again, Kate endured. But here's the cruel irony. The very silence meant to protect the monarchy left Kate exposed. Meghan, meanwhile, was free to speak, free to shape, free to sell her story to the world. And she did so brilliantly. The bridesmaid dress row became the emotional cornerstone of her victim narrative, the gateway that allowed her to expand into claims of neglect and racism. By making Kate look cruel, Meghan made herself look credible. And Harry? He sat beside her and let it happen. Let's talk about Harry's role here. For years, Kate had been his ally. She had softened William's edges, welcomed Harry into her home, even cooked meals for him when he was lonely. She was, by all accounts, the sister he never had. And yet, during that Oprah interview, when Meghan flipped the story, Harry said nothing. He let Kate's reputation burn to protect Meghan's narrative. That silence was a betrayal, not just of Kate, but of the bond he once shared with William. Do you see how devastating that was? The fracture wasn't just between Meghan and Kate anymore. It was between two brothers, now standing on opposite sides of a narrative war. William, protective of his wife, was enraged. Harry, loyal to Meghan, dug in deeper. And the monarchy itself began to splinter under the pressure. The dress row wasn't just a row anymore. It was the trigger for a family divide that still hasn't healed. And here's where the contradictions become unbearable. Meghan said Kate made her cry. Kate says Meghan made her cry. Both cannot be true. And yet, the world was forced to pick sides. Some believed Meghan, citing her calm delivery, her sympathetic framing, her willingness to share personal details. Others believed Kate, pointing to her reputation, her restraint, her long history of dignity. But the fact that this debate exists at all shows the true tragedy. The truth no longer mattered. Perception did. And perception was Meghan's battlefield. But Kate's confession at 43 shattered the illusion. For years, Meghan's version stood unchallenged. Then Kate, with her quiet, measured words, finally set the record straight. She admitted that Meghan had been demanding. She admitted that Charlotte had been upset. She admitted that she had cried, not Meghan. And she admitted that the flowers were not an apology, but a gesture of reconciliation. In one confession, Kate pulled the rug out from under Meghan's carefully constructed narrative. But here's the twist. Kate didn't just clear her name. She exposed Meghan's playbook. Think about it. If Meghan deliberately flipped the dress row, then her entire Oprah performance begins to look different. Every revelation, every tear, every sigh is suddenly cast in a new light. Was it all strategy? Was every detail curated to paint Meghan as the eternal victim and the monarchy as the eternal villain? Kate's confession suggests yes. And that raises a chilling question. If Meghan's narrative was a strategy, how far was she willing to take it? What else had been twisted? What else had been flipped? And how many more reputations would burn before the world realized what was happening? This is where the story takes an even darker turn. Because Meghan's narrative flip didn't just damage Kate. It damaged the monarchy's credibility. It created a world where every royal silence could be interpreted as guilt, where every private gesture could be weaponized, where every fracture could be spun into a headline. The dress row wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was an institutional crisis. But here's the cliffhanger. Meghan's manipulation of victimhood was only the beginning. The dress row may have flipped the narrative, but the real war was about to erupt on a much larger battlefield. A battlefield that would drag in the Queen, Charles, William, and even the very future of the monarchy itself. What if the bridesmaid dress row was just the fuse, and the real explosion was still to come? What if that small tear-filled moment in 2018 was simply the symbol of a much larger war between two women, two brothers, and an entire institution? Because once Meghan flipped the narrative, once Harry stayed silent, and once Kate was forced into quiet suffering, the stage was set for something far bigger, a family divide that would alter the course of the monarchy forever. Let's step into the palace corridors after the Oprah interview. The tension was suffocating. William, red with fury, pacing back and forth, demanding answers. Kate, pale but composed, her eyes betraying the weight of betrayal she felt. Charles, caught between his sons, urging restraint but privately seething at Meghan's audacity. And the Queen, the matriarch, watching her family's image, the crown's very lifeblood, fracture under the spotlight of global scandal. Imagine that atmosphere. Staff whispering behind doors. Phones ringing nonstop as press officers scrambled to draft statements that said everything and nothing all at once. And at the heart of it, one question nobody dared ask aloud. If Meghan could twist something as small as a dress row, what else might she twist? This was the beginning of what the media would soon dub the Great Divide. Because the dress row didn't just pit Meghan against Kate. It pitted Harry against William. And once those two brothers stood on opposite sides, the monarchy itself was dragged into the battlefield. Ask yourself this. Why did Harry stay silent during Oprah? Why didn't he defend Kate, the woman who had once been his sister, his confidant, his comfort after Diana's death? Because by then, his loyalty had shifted completely. Meghan wasn't just his wife, she was his world. Defending Kate would have meant undermining Meghan. And for Harry, that wasn't an option. His silence wasn't just complicity, it was a choice. And William never forgave him for it. This is where the emotional fracture cuts the deepest. William, protective of Kate, saw Harry's silence as betrayal. Kate, hurt and humiliated, saw Harry's silence as abandonment. And the monarchy, watching two brothers tear apart the bond that once symbolized its future, realized that something far bigger than a dress row was now at stake. Do you see how the cracks widen? A private row about lace and tulle became the metaphor for a family in collapse. But let's not lose sight of the human side here. Kate wasn't just a duchess caught in scandal. She was a new mother, a wife, a woman struggling with the same insecurities and pressures any of us would feel. She cried not because she was weak, but because she was human. And yet, in Meghan's retelling, that humanity was stripped from her, replaced with a coldness that wasn't hers to bear. And here's the cruel twist. Kate's silence, meant to protect the monarchy, ended up fueling Meghan's narrative. Because the world assumes that if you don't defend yourself, you must be guilty. Meghan knew this. She counted on it. And Kate, trapped by duty, handed her the perfect stage. But at 43, Kate shattered the silence. And when she did, she didn't just clear her name. She exposed the monarchy's greatest weakness, its reliance on silence in a world where noise wins. Now think about the consequences of that. If Meghan could use silence against Kate, what about Charles? What about William? What about the entire institution? Every royal silence became suspicious. Every unanswered accusation became believable. Meghan hadn't just flipped the bridesmaid row. She had rewritten the rules of the monarchy's survival. And the palace knew it. Which is why, after Oprah, crisis meetings were held behind closed doors. Advisors debated whether the Queen should issue a statement. Should they defend Kate? Should they push back against Meghan's narrative? In the end, the Queen delivered her famous line. Recollections may vary. Short, sharp, a veiled defense. But for Kate, it wasn't enough. It wasn't the full-throated vindication she craved. It wasn't the truth. And so the divide grew. Kate, nursing her private wounds. William, boiling with rage at Harry. Charles, fearful of the long-term damage. And Meghan and Harry, across the ocean, triumphant in their new role as truth-tellers, their narrative unchallenged, at least for the moment. But here's the cliffhanger. The dress row was only the first fracture. What came next wasn't just about two duchesses or even two brothers. It was about the very survival of the monarchy. Because Meghan's strategy wasn't to destroy Kate. It was to dismantle the firm itself. And the dress row was her opening salvo. What if the monarchy itself was the true target all along? What if Meghan's flip of the bridesmaid dress row wasn't just about humiliating Kate, but about undermining the very foundation of royal credibility? Because once Kate was cast as the aggressor, once Harry stood by in silence, the question wasn't just who made who cry. It was, can the monarchy be trusted at all? And that's when the real danger began. Let's paint the picture. The world had just watched Meghan's Oprah interview. Headlines blared across every continent. Clips went viral on TikTok, Twitter, YouTube. People who had never cared about royal gossip suddenly had an opinion on Kate Middleton. Meghan's version wasn't just believed, it was absorbed as fact. And with that, the carefully curated image of the monarchy, the perfect family, the graceful duchess, the dignified silence, was shattered. But here's the irony. For years, the monarchy's greatest weapon had been its silence. When Diana spoke, they stayed quiet. When scandals erupted, they said nothing. The mystique, the dignity, the restraint, it worked. But in 2021, in an age of social media and streaming, silence wasn't dignity anymore. It was weakness. And Meghan had exposed it. Kate's suffering in silence became the monarchy's suffering in silence. And the world turned against them. Now imagine being inside Buckingham Palace in those weeks. Staff were scrambling. Advisors argued. Should they release evidence? Should they leak emails, texts, testimonies from staff who were present during the dress row? There were rumors that aides wanted to speak out, to defend Kate, to tell the truth. But the Queen's mantra still ruled. Never complain, never explain. So they didn't. And once again, silence handed Meghan the victory. And Kate? She bore the brunt of it. Every public engagement was an ordeal. Every smile felt forced. Every headline was a reminder that the world now saw her as the cold duchess who made her sister-in-law cry. The humiliation was relentless, and the palace did little to shield her.